Welcome everybody. My name is John Immel. I'm the director of Joyful Belly Ayurveda, and today we are talking about subtle quality or Sukshma Guna. And right away I want to mention that this is one of the hardest lectures that I could give because when something's subtle, it's difficult to understand. But it turns out there's a lot of insight that we can provide into this mysterious, subtle quality of Ayurveda, and you'll come to see that subtle quality is actually the most important quality in Ayurveda. So again, my name is John Immel. Here's what I look like, and Sukshma Guna is the word in Sanskrit for subtle quality, written there on the screen so you know how to spell it. Sukshma Guna. All right, so what do the ancient texts tell us? That Sukshma uncovers or opens. And that's, I mean that in the sense of an open mind, or fully revealing something in all of its subtlety. Or also open can mean receptive. So something or someone that is receptive is subtle quality includes that as well. So the opposite of subtle is the gross quality in Ayurveda. And gross doesn't mean disgusting, by the way. It just means either large or manifested as opposed to something more ethereal, as subtle is. So the opposite of subtle is the gross quality. And I'll just do a quick brief review. We have other qualities that are kind of related to this, like light quality versus heavy quality. That measures the amount of mass in a substance. And liquid quality versus dense quality measures viscosity. Well, here we're talking about subtle versus gross, which measures size of something. And subtle things tend to be small and infinitesimal or unseen or translucent. Or immaterial as opposed to material. So subtle gross measures the materialization of something. Is something a material or is it just an idea? It measures manifestation, actualization, how corporal a thing is. Subtle also measures a depth of understanding. So depth of perception. Can you see the nuances in something? Subtle is going to capture that. Subtle is also going to capture the ability for something to change the nature of something else. So certain things, certain herbs or medicines or even drugs, right? Drugs do this. They change the nature of the person or the being. If you drink a cup of coffee, you know, you're really different after that cup of coffee than before the cup of coffee. So the ability of something to change the nature of something else is a measure of its subtleness. Therefore, all causes, when we talk about cause and effect, all causes philosophically are subtle if they have any effect on the nature of the being. All right, so a thought about something is subtle. But the actual thing you are thinking about is gross, right? It's material, and the thought is just an idea. Why should you care about subtle? Well, of course, the cause of all disease is something subtle. We'll cover that later. And but the real reason why you're going to be interested or should be interested in subtle quality is because by knowing subtle quality, you're going to know how to help get a person's head out of the clouds. Sometimes people are spacey, sometimes they are lost in thought, daydreaming, and that's a way of life for them. So the purpose of this lecture is to bring you out of the clouds and back into daily life, to get grounded, rooted, and stable. And we all know how important it is to be grounded, rooted, and stable. I said already that subtle... Oh, there we go. There's, you see a picture. This person has their head in the cosmos, right? Their eyes are closed. They're probably by themselves. They are contemplating cosmic things instead of the thing that's right in front of them. So I've said already that subtle things change the nature and essence of a person. And so that creates long-term effects, right? If the very nature of yourself is changing, then that's going to be hard to change back in a way, right? So subtle includes includes your worldview, it includes your beliefs, and it includes your spiritual practice. So what you who you think what you think a spiritual life is has a great effect on your nature, and so it's that discussion is included under subtle quality. Herbs, pharmaceuticals, alcohol, caffeine, street drugs, all that has a huge effect on a person's personality. So people who drink coffee to become a different person are recognize that coffee has a subtle quality. And in fact, subtle is considered the most potent guna in Ayurveda, the most potent quality in Ayurveda, the most potent medicine. It's more powerful than gross or heavy. And we all know that, right? Statements, cultural statements that reflect this are the pen is mightier than the sword. Well, what does that mean? It means you could be, Hulk Hogan or have those big Ripley muscles and all that, but ultimate power is wielded through philosophy, through ideas, and how that influences society and community and the people around us. So subtle is very powerful, and if you are able to influence your clients in a positive way with a certain thought, they're going to do a lot of the work for you, right? Because you could tell your clients how to change their diet, or you could create a craving in them for the right kind of foods, and then they will naturally seek out those foods and find it on their own. So it's very efficient to have that influence, if you can do it. So subtle includes all feelings, emotions, sensations, and experiences, right? Because none of those things are the thing itself. Our feeling is about the thing, our emotion is about the thing, our experience is about the thing, and our sensation of it is about the thing, but it's not the thing itself, right? The map is not the terrain. So pain, for example, is subtle because pain isn't the trauma, right? The trauma is the trauma, but pain is our sensation of the trauma. Often people equate the pain and the trauma as the same thing. They're not. So all psychological phenomena and all sensory phenomena are covered under subtle quality. And to the extent that our thoughts, feelings, emotions, sensations, and experiences affect our understanding, perception, and behavior, that measures the potency of that in terms of subtle quality. So how we feel naturally affects how we behave. Naturally affects our perception. Our experience of something influences our perception of it, and that influences our response. And therefore, as much as it changes our behavior, it ultimately changes our whole way of life. It changes our lifestyle. So we've got to pay close attention, because changes in the way we think have tremendous influences and consequences on our lifestyle and our health. All right, so why else should you care about subtle guna? Why does subtle guna matter? Because subtle guna also appreciates the complexity of health and the complexity of cause and effect. It would be nice if a client that came to you with weight gain problems and wanted to lose weight, it would be nice if you could tell them just stop eating ice cream, right? Or it'd be nice if you could tell a smoker to just stop smoking. But we all know it's more complicated than that. There's something more. It's something more difficult that we're trying to accomplish, which is a change in their actual behavior. And so they already know not to eat ice cream. They already know they don't want to be smoking, but it's hard for them to stop. So subtle introduces that idea that healing is complex, and therefore we should have more compassion for the client. So, examples of subtleness in the body. What does a person who is subtle look like? So even though subtle itself is very potent, a person who has an excess of subtle quality, a person who's easily influenced, whose nature is constantly changing, they generally don't have a lot of potency to their physical attributes. In fact, it's their lack of potency that makes them easily persuaded. So a person who has subtle quality may be slight in frame, a small size, a smallish nose or small eyes, thinning hair, thinning nails. Generally you hear Vata in all this, Vata dosha, Vata body type. A quiet voice, a quiet way of walking, slender, a slender person with thin skin and bones, who maybe they may be wispy or ethereal or even woo-woo. They may talk in a woo-woo way. I hope is that a technical term that these days, woo-woo. But a person who's more wispy, ethereal, easily changeable. And another type of subtle is here we go, otherworldly. I had a picture of a thin, frail, older person. So a person, when they get old and thin and frail, becomes a little more subtle, and they become anxious about everything. And I'll give an example of a client with excess subtle quality, just so you have a bit of a sketch here. I had a client who had so much knowledge, knew everything about nutrition, more than me, and I was like, well, why are you calling me about to have an Ayurveda consultation? It's almost like you know more than I do, right? That kind of thing. And but as I started to talk with this client, I found that she was living in a commune, in an intentional community that everyone was very spread out, and so she was very alone. She was single and lived by herself and far away from anyone in the woods. And she was also had very little resources, very little money, so she kept her house very cold. And so she lived in this cold house alone by herself. And the biggest obstacle after talking with her to changing her daily routine was care for her cat. And also that she couldn't tolerate any disturbance, like any noises and things. She was her ears had a heightened sensitivity to sound, and so any sound would just make her would really rock her world. So this client kind of almost lived on the fringe of the physical and the spiritual world in a way. She was kind of off in her head, off alone by herself in the woods, and so that person had a lot of subtle qualities. She's very frail individual. All right, so what are some archetypes that exemplify this? You already saw this spooky picture here of the ghost, this thin ghost floating in the room. This is a kind of scary picture. Sorry for showing you scary things. But a ghost is a bit otherworldly and a fairy, right? Here we see a fairy is very wispy. Look at those wings. They're otherworldly. It's very dreamy. Fairies are very dreamy. And you see that they're often presented as very thin, slender, wispy manner. Highly idealized. You see in this rendition, or artist's idea of a fairy is highly idealized and stylized. So a fortune teller. Oh, an angel. Angels are very ethereal, very subtle. Artists, priests, spiritual leaders. And then there's celebrities like Kate Moss, who pioneered that waif look as a model. So those are some archetypes and celebrities that would have excess of subtle quality. What about examples from the natural world? Bacteria are very subtle. You can't see them. Atoms, right? We know that all matter is made up of atoms, which is a mind-blowing thing. And anything mind-blowing, by the way, is a bit subtle quality. But atoms and radiation, right? If you have radiation from the sun and stuff, you can't really see it, right? You can see light, but not radiation. Sunset and sunrise are times of transition in the day that are very subtle. Midnight to 4 a.m. is a time of day that's very subtle. Feathers, leaves, air, and fog all have a subtle floating quality about them. A mouse, which you don't really see. A mosquito or a gnat gets you and you don't even notice until you feel the bite. Or a no-see-um. When I would visit my grandparents down in Florida, they called the gnats no-see-ums because they couldn't see the gnats at all. Goosebumps. A person gets goosebumps when they get that kind of chill that, oh, there's something, something in the air here. Maybe a presence. They feel a presence of something and get the chills or the goosebumps. Atmospheric gases, jellyfish. Oh, here's that picture of the old frail person holding a very new, not very frail puppy, right? So here we see an elderly person, and when you first look at this photo, you think she's actually sad. But then as you look at it a little bit more, you see that that's really just the lines and stuff on her face, that she may actually not be that sad right now. She actually looks a little more concerned than sad, maybe concerned for this little puppy. So let's see here. That I lost my my jellyfish photo. I had a nice photo of jellyfish. Ah, there it is. Right. So here we see the 4 a.m. It's like, oh no, you look at the clock and you see that it's 4 a.m. and you're like kind of spaced out, right? And you know, his thoughts are a little scattered, and you're kind of open at that time of the day. And then here's the photo of the jellyfish. You see they're just kind of floating. Anything that has that floating quality has a bit of ethereal or subtle quality to it. So, all emotions, what are the psychological characteristics of subtle quality, right? What is a person like who is subtle? Let's go through that. And here we see a kind of foggy, wispy thing. It's almost like, where does the body end and the spirit begin, right? So subtle captures this essence of the equivalence of mind, body, and spirit. And psychologically, all emotions have subtle quality because they are intangible sensations. We're not even often aware of our emotions unless we sit and observe them, or someone points them out to us and they say, hey, you're pretty angry right now. Oh, yeah, I guess you're right. I am being a little angry right now. I'm sorry. Let me try to calm down, right? So we don't often notice our emotions right away. And emotions are often fleeting, like much psychological phenomena. So that's kind of subtle, too. Falling in love, the feeling of love, has a huge influence on our nature. Person who has an excess of subtle quality is easily affected and easily influenced by others. They are open to new ideas and open-minded individuals in general. They learn quickly. They're adaptive. They can change on a dime. A person who has a lot of subtle quality may be an empath. They constantly feel what other people are feeling around them. So the ability to walk in another's shoes, that's what empathy is, and feel what they feel and have a shared experience. And subtle people can do that. A subtle person's identity is constantly changing. They're so easily influenced that, if you don't see them for a few years and then you see them again, you see that they've made like huge decisions and changes in their life, and they're kind of a different person. So they're constantly shape-shifting, constantly changing. A person who has a lot of subtle quality may have a creative, inspired mind. So they are imaginative and invest in ideas as opposed to nuts and bolts things. They invest in concepts. They have a hope or a faith or belief in things unseen. So subtle quality allows for intuition and the clarity of mind and dreaming as well. Dreams are subtle. Here we see a person kind of flying in their dream or floating in their dream in the night. So these can all be good things, obviously. All the gunas, all the qualities of Ayurveda are both good and bad. But in today's lecture, we're going to focus on how to help people who have imbalances of this, who do this too much. So we're going to talk about how to help ground a person who's flying in their dreams, for example. A person who has excess subtle quality may be so expansive and seek connection in so many different things that they're hard to understand. And you see this like creative geniuses. They expound on something. A person with excess subtle quality can be almost clairvoyant and see right through you. Talking to them, they have an ethereal feeling when you talk to them. They kind of almost talk in this distant way. They're like, oh, the world is so wonderful, it's so beautiful. They're kind of almost talking in another worldly way, right? In this universal way. And we see people that kind of get stuck in that mode. People who have that sort of clairvoyant style, they're aware of other people's subtle bodily cues. Oh, that person's energy was so this or so that. It's a very subtle way of talking. People who have a lot of subtle quality can understand the hidden details and listen for things that are beneath the top layer. They have lots of insight into the situation. And oftentimes they equate insight with wisdom. And that's not true, actually. Insight and wisdom are very different. Wisdom orders our insights, right? Wisdom tells us which insights are the most important right now. It's not the insight itself, but many people confuse the two. They think any insight, any deep perception is wisdom, and that's not the case. Wisdom just orders our knowledge. Wisdom says this that an individual should do this instead of this right now, even if both are true or both are good, right? I can eat breakfast or start work for the day, and both of those things may be good things to do, but which do I do first? That's wisdom, right? Wisdom orders knowledge. So a person who has that clairvoyant quality can see those hidden details, but often gets lost in them, and that's part of the problem of excess subtle. They get lost in the sea of ideas and lost in the sea of subtlety. So they perceive. People who have a lot of subtle quality perceive the very essence of something. They perceive the very nature of something, and that's pretty powerful when a person can do that. A person who has subtle quality has no or wants no possessions, right? They're so independent. They're kind of like above reality in a way, and to such a person, when in excess, in some sense, detachment is good, right? We shouldn't be like overly attached to the treasures of this world. We should put our attention towards something higher, towards God, to eternal truths, right? Instead of temporal things. But a person who does this to excess, nothing really matters to them. The things and people around them don't matter to them, so they have no real passion. And you, even in that way of talking I mentioned before, that sort of subtle, almost universal, clairvoyant way of talking, it's very passionless. There's nothing like, yeah, we're going to do that right now. Come on, let's go, right? There's a little bit of distance, and they're kind of floating beyond and above things. Nothing's really cherished to such a person because it's all just temporal and will go away anyway. So things lose their meaning, and we always have to be careful of that. When we enter too much into subtle realms, it's almost like tangible things lose their meaning, and we have to be cautious about that. So someone who seeks detachment as their final end spiritually will have a lot of excess of subtle quality, and that's liberation theology, right? To liberate the self from the matter and material of the world is a liberation theology, and that kind of person will seek detachment as a final spiritual end, as opposed to attachment to the good. So what we want to do is detach ourselves from the things that hurt us and attach ourselves to things that are good for us, to meaning, to true meaning of things, right? The love of the parent has of a child has a lot of truth in that, and it's worth it, right? It's a very valuable thing. So we want to attach to the good, detach from the bad, and attach to the good, and that looks more like salvation theology. This idea of that possessions themselves aren't necessarily bad. So we should, but we should put them in their proper place and understand the amount of meaning that they have, and not give them too much meaning or too much value either. So we got to get to that balance. All right, a person, psychological characteristics of a person who has a lot of subtle quality, posts things like this on Facebook. Right here we see this, pretty expansive kind of photo of this person who's kind of in cosmic realms, and people who have subtle quality have a very expansive mind. There's no boundaries. They see like connection between them and everything. So subtle quality integrates and connects things that appear different, right? We look at a tree and we look at a rabbit and we think, oh, those things are very different, and they are, but they're both made of atoms. And so the person a subtle person integrates and connects everything together. Ayurvedic practitioners, I think, are at risk of over-connecting things, and because Ayurveda practitioners themselves are taught to think associatively, right? like, oh, two things have the same guna, therefore they're equivalent, or two things have subtle qualities, so they're both subtle, they're both the same. And so Ayurveda practitioners, through the Ayurvedic methods, can tend to over-connect things because they tend to abstract things down to the 20 qualities. So Ayurvedic students will say things like, oh, my teacher told me that a swollen tongue or scallops on the edge of the tongue means a person has parasites. And is that really true, though? It is true that a swollen tongue can come from malabsorption, and malabsorption can come from parasites. But does that mean that a swollen tongue comes from parasites? And the answer to that is no, because malabsorption can come from many sources. So this is logically, this is the idea that X is related to Y, and Y is related to Z, but X does not necessarily mean Z, right? So mathematically, you may say that, yeah, there's a relationship between all those things, between swollen tongue and parasites, but the relationship could be very tenuous. And so what I've seen in my practice is that Ayurveda practitioners that don't overdo that don't overconnect, but stay focused on the nuts and bolts things, do really well as practitioners. So I'm going to suggest that. All right, here are some, I wanted to create a word bank for everybody around words that convey subtleness, and you see this huge list here. Not going to go over it, but I'm putting it on the screen here so that you can see and stop the recording and copy these down or look at them or contemplate them a little bit. Contemplate the subtlety of all these subtle words. So here, I'll give a few examples here. Things that are immaterial, transparent, or translucent. Or things that are small, infinitesimal things. Things that are ethereal, and as in like very expansive or profound or intuitive or boundaryless or atmospheric. Ambient music, right, is very ethereal. Things that are very mysterious or mesmerizing or fantastic, beyond our grasp. The invisible spiritual world is... and things that are indirect or implied or inferred, right? Oh, what was the meaning behind what that person said? What were they really getting at, right? That's very subtle. All right, what are some of the functions of subtle quality? Beneficial functions of subtle quality. Subtle covers all absorption, including absorption of nutrients, including absorption of oxygen, also including absorption and integration of sensory experiences, right? Again, here I'm putting them on this list so that you can stop the recording and copy these down if you want to. So let's go over and get into some of them. Breathing is subtle, right? So the breath gives life, and it influences all movement in the body, and we see a lot of subtle spiritual practices kind of focus on the breath. So in the area of the lungs and oxygenation, it's breathing is a very subtle thing, and some people who focus on the breath are searching for that mystical union. All right, the digestive system. What are some subtle things in the digestive system? The ability to break down food. I mean, really, you put anything in your body, and it breaks it down into something that your body can use to make itself, right? You turn apples into humans, chicken leg into a human being, an oyster, and some parsley, right, into a human being. The fact that your body can break all those things down and absorb it and use it as food is a pretty incredible example of subtle quality. So all digestion and breaking down of food, nutrient absorption. Another thing that's very subtle in the digestive tract is the microbiome. It's constantly shifting, constantly changing. No one knows how to keep it healthy, right? But we all know it's important to health. So our microbiome. How about our circulatory system? And here's a fascinating, this has been going around in museums lately. I can't remember the name of the museum, but where, I don't know what they did, was they pumped some kind of fluid through the person after they died that hardened, and then they burned away the rest of the body or something. I don't know exactly how they did this, but this is an actual circulatory system of an actual person made with this sort of plastic resin that hardened, and pretty fascinating to see. And what we see here is that blood infuses and permeates into the whole body, which is pretty cool also. And so So that's an example of subtle quality. On the cellular level, nutrient and oxygen assimilation into the cell is an example of subtle quality, a beneficial function of subtle quality. And also excretion of cellular waste into the interstitial fluid. The fact that these cells can like absorb these things and get rid of the wastes is an example of subtle quality. On the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis is also very subtle because we respond quickly and instantly to stimuli, and our stress hormones and all that in the way that we react and respond to things is very subtle. So hormones themselves are all subtle, by the way. Subtle includes all cause and effect. So a function of subtle is all cause and all effect. It's pretty broad, right? That's why I said this lecture is so hard, because it includes everything. But I'm going to try to keep it as short as possible. Subtle includes all communication in the body. So the fact that that one part of the body can communicate with the other via hormones or the nervous system is pretty awesome and unbelievable, right? It's like, oh my goodness, how does our body, all these different parts, work in synchrony with each other? Pretty astounding. I mentioned already, subtle includes a person's worldview. Subtle is the one guna that is spiritual. Beliefs are very subtle. And I've said already, your concept of who God is and what the spiritual life is dramatically shapes your worldview and is the ultimate cause of your lifestyle. And your lifestyle, of course, is the cause of your diet. And diet is the cause of health and in so many ways. And so there's this direct relationship between our beliefs and spiritual life and our daily health. So when we're talking about subtle, beliefs, God, religion, all of that enters into the discussion. And that's, that's always a challenging and very subtle discussion, right? So anything that includes a change in lifestyle falls under the domain of subtle quality as well. So it's not just our spiritual life that has a subtle influence on us, but our life situation. There may be situations that are beyond our control and have nothing to do with our beliefs, such as giving birth to a baby, right? If we have a new baby, you can't just go up to a mom with a new baby and say, oh, you need to take more care of yourself. You have to spend less time caring for your baby. And the mom's going to be like, no way, I live for my baby, right? And so it's very subtle and to figure out what should that mom do in that situation to be healthy and care for the baby. It's a challenge, right? How you've been raised. You may have certain spiritual life, but how you were raised still has a profound influence on your identity and who you are. And, your living situation in general, your work situation, financial situation, any traumas you've had, etc., etc., etc. So many different things fall under the domain of subtle quality. And I've already said that anything to do with the nervous system or the mind is very much about subtle quality, perception, learning, adaptability, change, communication, etc. So lots to think about there. So obviously, subtle quality gives us the ability to learn and adapt, and we want to get all those benefits of being able to learn and adapt, but without the instability that too much change can create. We want to have a stable character, right? What is a character but a personality that's firmly established in the individual? And so subtle guna is kind of characterless because the person changes and shapeshifts so frequently and their nature changes. What we want to do is get that character firmly established in the individual. All right. Pathogenesis of excess subtle quality. What are the things that aggravate subtle quality? Ama aggravates subtle quality because it irritates the nervous system and can be overstimulating, and the person becomes distracted and spaced out. If you notice this next time you're gassy, right? If you have a bunch of gas, you kind of like space out a little bit, and it's easy to daydream and become distracted. Any kind of discomfort actually is very distracting and makes a person space out a little bit. Parasites. This is a worm here, I believe a roundworm, some kind of nematode, and that parasite's going to create a lot of ama. And parasites are also way more insidious than this, right? Than just creating ama. Parasites often release hormones to change your nature, to change your food cravings, for example. We've all heard that yeast makes a person crave more sweet food. Parasites can change your personality on a deeper level, too. This is fascinating to me. Toxoplasmosis is a feline and mouse disease. You may have heard of it. That is easily contracted by humans as well. And it affects from 11 to 55% of a population. Unbelievable, right? Depending on where you live. If you live in an area with lots of cats, for example, you may be more likely to catch toxoplasmosis. And mice who have toxoplasmosis, a peculiar thing happens to them. They start to crave cat urine. And so they go towards places that have cat urine in them. And you're like, well, why would they do that? Well, the organism wants the mouse to do these self-destructive behavior of hanging out around cat urine, because if the cat eats the mouse, then the cat will get the toxoplasmosis, and the disease can spread itself that way. So one of the ways this disease spreads itself is by basically making the mouse put its life in danger. Well, guess what? Humans who contract toxoplasmosis have also been shown in research studies to exhibit self-destructive behaviors. They are more likely to have bipolar disorder and schizophrenia as well. So, pretty crazy stuff. Another example of a parasite that influences behavior is rabies. Rabies makes a dog aggressive and more likely to bite somebody, and when they bite them, they spread the disease. And that's pretty scary because rabies is fatal. All right, pathogenesis of excess subtle quality. Any kind of blood chemistry imbalance is going to affect your entire nervous system, right? So we're looking for things that are going to have a huge effect on the nervous system, and of course your blood chemistry does. So dehydration, electrolyte imbalance, hormone imbalance, eating too much sugar, drinking too much caffeine, anything that has a pharmacological effect on your blood is going to have a profound effect on your nervous system, which is going to have a profound effect on your whole being and nature. Therefore, it's subtle. So, insomnia, right? Being awake all night. This guy does not look very happy. It scrambles your liver and makes your whole body tense. And that's why in Ayurveda, when a person has insomnia, we always give them vasodilating herbs. Insomnia aggravates vata, and it's hard to even think straight after losing a night's sleep. Any kind of extremes can create subtle quality. Strong austerities, food austerities, anorexia, spiritual practices that are very austere, harsh dieting, etc., fasting, even marathons, pretty extreme on your body. It can introduce a lot of subtle quality. Any irregularity of any kind, irregularity in your routine can cause subtle quality, getting sick, moving to a new town, and also breaking a bone. Mental disturbances and disorders also create subtle quality. Especially terror, fear, and anxiety make a person have a lot of excess subtle quality. Pain and discomfort, doing anything unnatural or weird, right, can introduce subtle quality. It kind of puts the person into the unknown or uncharted territories. It's the opposite of tried and true. And so once a person gets into those experimental realms, they can become excess subtle quality. Poor discernment. Making bad choices increases subtle quality, right? It's just, we think something's good for us, but the actuality is that it's not. The reason why we couldn't see it is because the cause and effect were very subtle. Exposure to disturbing media, songs, horror movies that disturb us can introduce subtle quality. As I said before, ambient music itself can be, it really aggravates subtle quality. All those early 80s songs, there was this period in the early 80s where like all the music was very, had a lot of subtle quality in it. The sound of wind at the mountaintop, or or ambience, a lot of ambient too. You saw that in the early O's too, early 2000s. There was a lot of ambient music around that time, and sometimes you still see it. So check that out if you want to hear some good ambient, different ambient styles, early 80s and early O's music. Trauma, any kind of trauma, physical or mental, insanity or mental illnesses, forgetfulness, and distraction in general. Addiction, substance abuse is another way to introduce subtle quality, especially psychedelics and hallucinogens, but also sugar, caffeine, alcohol, tobacco, and hard drugs. All right, what are some complications of, oh, there you go. There's a photo of a person smoking. I can't tell exactly what they're smoking, but it doesn't look like a store-bought cigarette. All right, so things that, complications of excess subtle. That if a person has a lot of subtle quality, they become inconsistent. Subtle can be catabolic. That's why the person becomes almost like very slender and thin. Change that requires effort is all catabolic initially anyway. Subtle leads to unpredictable outcomes. I said before, doing something unnatural or weird, and even the use of that word weird these days has become almost unacceptable socially, right? You're not allowed to call anything weird anymore. But the fact is that doing anything that's experimental has unpredictable outcomes. Does that mean we should shun it? No. We should perhaps explore somewhat, but if a person has excess subtle quality, they have to be very cautious about that. The long-term effects are hard to anticipate, so we should have a little caution around them. All right, what about examples of subtle quality in each of the srotamsi, in each of the different management systems of the body? Let's review it. So in our energy management system, pranava srotas, heart palpitations and arrhythmia make a person very subtle. Tachycardia, right? A fast heartbeat. Any irregular breathing can also put a person into those subtle realms. Hyperventilation, gasping, even the breathy speech I mentioned before. The food management system, anava srotas, fasting practices. This poor woman had anorexia, and you see here how thin she is, especially in that middle photograph, just almost like a skeleton there. And it looks like she recovered and has a lot more flesh on her bones, nice, full, happy, more satisfied look here than on the left. And so this is a before and after shot. Pretty intense anorexia can be. And it brings a person to these subtle realms. A lot of anorexics have this focus on purity and this focus on being very clear of all ama, all toxins, etc., etc., and that leads them to not eat. So any eating disorder, lack of appetite in the food management system. Parasites in the food management system, leaky gut. Leaky gut is very subtle, right? Because your gut is supposed to prevent things from crossing the barrier unless it's good for your body, right? Your gut's supposed to absorb nutrients and prevent everything else from getting absorbed through it. But a lack of boundaries in the gut, right? All lack of boundaries and all porosity is subtle quality. And so in leaky gut, things cross the gut barrier into the bloodstream, and so that really whacks a person out. It really totally spaces them out because they have all this stuff in their blood now that shouldn't be there, and their nervous system, it really makes their nervous system go haywire, and that's hard to deal with. So hard for the individual to keep grounded when they have that. Any kind of malabsorption as well, which is just the opposite. Not enough is getting absorbed into the gut. What about in the water management system? Disorders associated with subtlety in the water management system. Ambuva srotas, dehydration, and electrolyte imbalance. What about the lymphatic management system, or rasava srotas? Anything that affects blood or plasma chemistry, including toxins, ama, blood sugar levels, hormones. The effects of anything we eat, right? If you eat an asparagus, it has a different effect than eating a tomato. Etc. Any kind of emaciation or depletion that results in depleted ojas, or depletes the person in generally and causes weight loss and all that, falls under Medavasrotas, the fat management system, as well as Rasavasrotas. So the depleted blood generally makes a person a little bit more, and puts them a little more into subtle realms. Insulin resistance is also a problem of, it's actually not enough subtle quality. Panic attacks and a person who's constantly sick also falls under subtle quality. Blood management system, or Raktavasrotas, we have anemia, can make a person really subtle. And then also jaundice. We see this yellow eye here. It means that there's bile, what do you call it, components in the blood. And that's a pitta disorder, often from a weak liver. And heavy menstruation or internal bleeding can cause anemia also, and that makes a person more subtle, right? An anemic person is kind of floats like a ghost. All right. The muscle management system, Mamsavasrotas, any kind of tremors. Tremors are subtle because they involve a loss of nervous system control, and communication between the mind and the muscle is lost. How about muscle wasting? That loss of vigor creates a more etheric personality, right? A person who's vigorous and hardy is kind of stalwart and stubborn, but a person who has muscle wasting, that loss of vigor creates a more etheric personality that's easily persuaded. Pain, any kind of pain that affects the whole psyche, so the person becomes grumpy, irritated, or may even feel hopeless. Fibromyalgia, for example, MS and Parkinson's, or other areas where subtle quality enters into the muscle. The fat management system, Medavasrotas, I already talked about emaciation and low body weight. So you want to help a person become a little more hardy, so that they, to overcome that subtle, wispy, ethereal personality. Adrenal fatigue, another example in the Medavasrotas, the fat management system. What about bone management? Here we see the bone density is very low on the right and very high on the left. So, bone management, Astivasrotas, a person will have loss of bone density, as in osteoporosis and osteopenia. And also, you see thin hair, thin skin, thin nails. Skin isn't an Astivasrotas. That's not in bones, but hair and nails and teeth are. The nerve management system, Mahajavahasrotas, I talked a lot about that already, but any kind of degenerative brain disease as well as some of the things we've already talked about. The reproductive system, Shukra or Artavavahasrotas, any kind of hormonal balance in this system is going to increase subtle quality. And here I want to talk about the sort of biggest cause of aggravated subtle quality there is, which is bad relationships. And I mean sexual relationships here. So sexuality is a fundamental biological imperative, right? We all, our whole being is organized around what? Eating and reproducing, right? And of course, we have our soul, which is oriented towards God as well. I mean, we have lots of orientations here, but our sexuality and eating are kind of really big ones physically. And so naturally, that whole subject reaches a lot of media attention because everybody knows it's really important, right? And nobody wants anyone else to tell them how to handle their sexuality, right? But it's an important topic where subtle is concerned. Because of its importance, it has a profound effect on our whole being. So issues like birth control are, and by this I mean the pill, taking that pill, is very subtle, right? Birth control pills are very subtle because they disrupt the nature of the reproductive organs. Our reproductive organs are supposed to function in a certain way, and anything that interferes with that interferes with this biological imperative and goes very deep. But not just the pill, but all contraception itself that interferes with our sexuality, it has a huge influence on culture. And we've seen this, that the tremendous revolution in human sexual behavior since the introduction to contraceptive devices of all kinds. And so whether you think that is good or bad, it's undeniable that that there has been a tremendous change in culture because of birth control itself, and particularly a person who takes the pill, because it disrupts the nature of the reproductive organs itself. We have to wonder, how is that disrupting the nature of the whole person? And so it seems very subtle and simple. Seems very simple and easy to just take that pill, but we've all seen how that small choice has exerted a tremendous influence on society. So it's no secret that that relationships themselves are extremely important. Our sexual relationships, not just the use of contraception, but our sexual relationships themselves are extremely important. And a bad relationship is truly the biggest drain on our vitality. Right? We all know this. We all know that it's not just that we ate some ice cream last night. That's for most of us. It's that bad relationships. We seem to intuitively know that that's at the root of most of the problems that we have in our life. So sexual relationships themselves are very subtle. Any kind of sexuality in the relationship creates a tremendously strong bond that's difficult to disentangle, right? So once we're in a sexual relationship, we're bonded, and now in a way we can also be stuck, right? So physical intimacy creates emotional hopes and dreams. Once we have that physical intimacy, we have a hope and a dream that we're going to be united, right? That we're going to be united with our beloved, that we're going to experience the joy and the wonder of true love. And that desire is very natural when physical intimacy is present, because our hearts are made for connection. And so physical intimacy does have a profound and subtle effect on the heart. And don't we want it to be that way, right? What happens if no, it's like, oh no, that's not the case. Our sexuality has no effect on the heart. Well, there's a kind of cynicism in that, right? And so really our heart is made for connection, and having that tremendous intimacy exerts a huge influence on us, and we know it. So this modern idea of sexual liberation proposes that it's healthy to experiment with sexuality early in a relationship, and outside of any kind of real tangible commitments, and that has a huge effect on our whole population and our society. So intense intimacy early in the relationship causes the heart to invest its hopes in the relationship before that complete self-sacrificial love is present, and so now we're in that bond that's difficult to get out of, and so if we think of sex as something very special, then we're going to have that connection formed. We're going to have that strong bond, or the opposite. If we sex will lose its specialness, lose its meaning, and there can be a sort of cynicism about it as well. So, what's the problem with it? With all of this, what's the problem with being overly bonded in a relationship where we don't really want to be there, or we aren't really committed? Is that our false hopes in the relationship eventually crushed? Our entanglement may end a year later, or 5 years later, or 10 years later, with a broken heart, a loss of trust in the opposite sex, and so to prevent that intense influence, the heart must be protected from intimacy until the context is safe. And I don't only mean sexual intimacy here, but also emotional intimacy. Any kind of intimacy at all, really, creates a strong connection and a strong investment of feelings. So non-committal relationships or sexual intimacy and tenuous relationships lead to a lot of instability. If we become entangled in a relationship that lasts years together, then when the relationship ends, if it's not really meant to be, so to speak, then the emotional investment of those years is lost. So also we should talk about instability of that in general. 50% of all children in our modern society are born out of the context of a marriage or a lifelong commitment, creating instability and lots of moving back and forth for the children. A loss of involvement of one parent, which unfortunately usually means the dad, but not always the case. And so this is, this has to be looked at in our society, and you'll see it in clients as well. This long-term entanglements in their life that really are sucking the vitality right out of them. And the fix for that is to stop the physical intimacy until that relationship is truly bonded on all levels. All right. So reproductive system, subtle quality in reproductive system. Sex does have a very powerful effect on our nature and our way of being, and so we have to be extremely careful with it. Our sweat management system, Swetavahasrotas, breaking out into a cold sweat. Anytime in my life I've broken out into a cold sweat, it's because of some kind of near out-of-body experience. Too much ama, etc., will cause you to break out into a cold sweat. I was talking with a friend who has prostate cancer a few weeks ago, and all of a sudden he broke out into this cold sweat, dripping everywhere, literally. And it was because of the ama from the chemo suddenly overwhelming his system. And that cold sweat, breaking out into a cold sweat, is associated with swooning. The urine management system, Mutravasrotas. A person can be urine retentive. Like you see kids doing the little pee-pee dance all the time. They're holding in their urine for some reason. They don't want to go to the bathroom, or they're too busy playing, or for whatever reason or not, people tend to do that. They do it with anal retentiveness as well. They hold it in unconsciously, and that really stimulates and overstimulates the nervous system. All right. We've talked a lot about the mind, Manovasrotas, already, so I'm just going to skip over that. All right, what about pathogenesis by the various gunas of subtle quality? Gunas of subtle quality are the gunas of vata for the most part, light, dry, rough. I didn't put cold here. It could be included. Maybe yes, maybe not. Hot can also be subtle, so I left it out. But soft and clear, and also sattva. All of those are very subtle. So purification rituals, any kind of purification at all. We see a very pure person sitting here in a very pure landscape in meditation. I don't even know if you can even see she's on a beach, and she's sitting on very white sand here. So cleansing and austerities of any kind and purification rituals can put a person in subtle realms. You see here that this person's in a subtle realm right now. Austerity detaches the will. So let's talk about that. Why would an austerity or a cleansing make a person more subtle? Let's map that equation out so it's obvious to everybody. Austerity detaches the will from the appetite. So a person has an appetite for food, but they say, no, I am not going to eat. So their will is detached from the appetite. And as soon as you break that bond between the appetite and the will, passions and all attachments themselves are eliminated as well. Right? That's why austerity is such a big part of Buddhism. But attachments form the identity of the person, right? And so there's this curious thing here, right? Our passions and our attachments are our identity. So in having these austere practice, we're really sort of getting over ourselves in a way, or we become detached from our very identity itself. So our identity is formed by what we care about, what we cherish, and what we treasure. And through the passions, we become rooted in a time and place, forming passions to particular people and places. It's not that I'm attached to people in general. I'm attached to a particular person. Right? In my case, my wife. I'm very attached to my wife. She's great. she's incredible person, or we somehow have an incredible relationship, and that's awesome. And I can say that, you know, that's part of my identity is to be attached to her. So when the appetite, passions, and attachments are eliminated, the identity can become uprooted. And then the nature of the person is open to change, right? As soon as, if I had this huge austerity and detachment effect, I'd be open to all sorts of change, right? All would be, I would open my mind up to everything, right? And I would wipe the slate clean. I'd be totally liberated. I mentioned before, liberation theology. I'd be totally liberated from even my own identity. So cleansing and austerities put a person into the subtle realms because it detaches the will from the appetite. Examples of austerity include poverty, fasting, and breath retention. Actually, breath retention is the ultimate detachment, right? These breath retentive practices and pranayama are really ultimate fasting, because we're fasting from the immediate life itself, almost, right? And in just a few minutes we'll die without breath. So if you're doing breath retention, you know, you're really confronting your own mortality in this profound way. The strongest attachment we have is attachment to being alive itself. Well, actually, that's not the case. Our strongest attachment is our spiritual idea of who God is, right? There are many people who are willing to die for that. But incidentally, mortality and death are a very strong attachment. And any kind of weight loss or austerity, especially in the diet, will increase that ether element. All right. What about dry quality? Dryness creates blood chemistry imbalances, which irritate the whole nervous system and can compromise digestion. That's how that creates subtle quality. Dehydration, we mentioned it already. What about rough quality? Any kind of extremes that shock the person, kind of, you know, deeply influence their nature. Any kind of extreme discipline. A vegan diet is pretty extreme discipline. So any kind of irregularity and trauma that's rough, like breaking a bone, can create an irregularity, and that has a profound effect on the person. So rough is not subtle in the sense of it being mysterious or hard to comprehend. Rough is subtle just because it penetrates thoroughly into the nature of the person. Mobile quality also can create irregularities, irregular routine, irregular eating habits, changing time zones, and all change itself has subtle effects. Soft quality. Soft quality is really created by subtle quality. So subtle quality softens a person's personality. They become very yin in nature, very receptive, and that receptivity is softness. So subtle is the opposite of bold and direct, and it's yang that's bold and direct. A person who has weak boundaries, and a soft person will have very weak boundaries and will be overly sensitive. Clear quality. Cleansing is always catabolic. We talked about austerities and the relationship between clarity, purification, austerity, and subtle quality already. Anything that depletes ojas increases subtlety. So people who have an overly simplistic model of purity are constantly cleansing and purging themselves. And that I say oversimplistic model of purity because there's also a lot of purity in love. And love is not a cleansing, but it's an attachment. What about sattva quality? Sattva is all about awareness. So in sattva, we become aware in the end of the entire cosmos, right? And so it's this motionless awareness, this motionless stillness, is what's, in a way, sattva perceives all things. And so any kind of, when you're focused on awareness, you're increasing subtleness. What about pathogenesis by the tastes? Bitter, pungent, and sour. Well, bitter is subtle because it creates clear quality. It's stimulating and refreshing and wakes you up. Pungent is subtle because it wakes you up and increases awareness. Sour is subtle because it's stimulating as well, and also because it opens up the vessels. Sour quality dilates the blood vessels. And also aromatic taste. Aromatic isn't really one of the 6 tastes, but I'm going to mention it here because it's so important to subtle quality. But like peppermint and things like that are highly aromatic really open up and relax all the muscles, all the blood vessels, and everything in our body, and really kind of create a lot of ether element. All right, what about pathogenesis by the elements? Ether defines subtle. I mean, need I say more? Ether is completely porous, has absolutely no substance, and is totally immaterial. Air itself also lacks substance. Air is characterized by change, and so I think of traveling musician, wind, lack of a routine, all that belongs under air element. And fire element is characterized as transformation. What about the doshas of subtle quality? Well, really any of the doshas, but especially Vata and Pitta. Vata is the most subtle of the doshas, Kapha is the least because Kapha has so many dull and gross qualities, and they tend to not focus in the spiritual realms. All right, let's look at causes of subtle quality. All disease has a subtle cause at its root. And here we see this snake hidden in the branches of a tree. So easy to miss it. So everybody avoids creating problems for themselves on purpose, right? None of us go out and say, I'm going to create a problem for myself today. We just don't do that. So we get ill and we have accidents because of something that we didn't anticipate. Something subtle. So all illness comes from a blind spot, you might say. That we weren't aware that eating lots of pizza was going to affect us. Or we were aware but couldn't stop ourselves because of some other belief that had wound its way into our system. So illness comes from something from a blind spot, something that was too subtle to see it coming. And that's why the Western system of medicine symbol is a snake around a pole. You've seen that, 2 snakes wrapped around a pole. That's the symbol of Western medicine because snakes are subtle, like disease. Snakes creep up on you and you don't even know they're there. They're silent. And we all, if disease were a lion, we would see it coming from a mile away, and we would protect ourselves. So examples of diseases that are very subtle: bacterial infections. We can't see the bacteria, so we can't protect ourselves from it. Parasite eggs are too small to see without a microscope, so we may ingest the parasite without knowing it. Even false cravings and bad behaviors. What is a bad behavior? Why do we do a bad behavior? We do it because we think it's going to be good for us, but it turns out that it's not good for us. So our lack of judgment, our inability to see it is because of subtle quality. So time is also a cause that is subtle, right? The biggest thing that destroys ojas is time. And also, I want to say that one of the things that's subtle itself is really all of Ayurveda. Ayurveda itself is a very subtle. This is perhaps very meta to introduce in the conversation, but the doshas themselves are pretty subtle concepts. All the concepts in Ayurveda are a bit subtle. So Ayurveda attempts to deal with the subtlety of disease. So again, pointing out the fact that this is a particularly difficult topic to teach because you could kind of put all of Ayurveda in it. I talked already about how change is hard. You can't just tell a mom to have more self-care when she's taking care of a baby. You can't just tell a kapha person to stop eating ice cream. They already know they shouldn't be eating ice cream. So you have to, I can't tell my Italian grandpa not to eat spaghetti anymore with meat sauce because it has wheat, nightshades, and beef, right? I can't tell him that. Spaghetti and with meat sauce is a part of his heritage. So I could tell him, but he's not necessarily going to change it. I have to work a little more subtly than that if I want to be effective. Many of my clients will come to me in clinic and say, I knew you were going to tell me not to drink coffee in today's session and that I would have to give it up. So I had 3 cups of coffee this morning as a farewell to coffee. And you're like, well, if you know it's bad for you, why did you drink the 3 cups? But, it's hard on folks. All right, so what are some lifestyle causes of subtle quality? I've mentioned it already. An erratic schedule or no routine, especially changing your address, or excess travel, or poor sleeping habits. Also, eating food or drugs that alter the mind, especially psychedelics. Exposure to toxicity. Too much time in your head, right? This is subtle quality. Most people these days have mentally heavy jobs with little physical labor, which leads to an imbalance in subtle quality, because the person is stuck in their mind all day without a physical release. Also, any kind of loneliness or isolation increases subtle guna, because the person is spending time alone and in their head, and they have all these great thoughts, but are those thoughts based in reality? It's hard to know when you're by yourself, right? We need others to help us stay grounded. Anyone who identifies with their feelings. There are some people who just live life emotionally and are always swayed by their own feelings. They're not like, they're not rational folks. They're more just emotional folks. And some people also, by the way, can be too rational and also be very subtle. So I'm not just harping on the emotional folks here. But if you focus on the emotions instead of the reality, you can, that's very material, that focusing on emotions instead of the reality of the material is very subtle. And feelings are subjective. We hope our feelings are objective, right? If something makes us angry, we hope that our anger is justified. But it isn't always. And sometimes we find out that our anger wasn't justified at all. So feelings are supposed to accurately reflect what is real, but often they don't. So if a person overemphasizes how they feel, that could create too much subtle quality. And of course, if a person underemphasizes feeling, they may miss the boat too. So what about you? Do you have a bias for one or the other? Feelings or rationale? All right. Let's see. I've talked about excessive fasting. Too much pranayama. If you're doing these intense breathing practices, that is going to really increase subtle quality pretty fast, especially if you're doing breath retention. Anyone who does intense sports and has an intense athletic life, marathons, triathlons, hang gliding. Even too much time in a hot sauna can make you dizzy and spacey. All right. So, what about spiritual causes? Ayurveda can be used to analyze the nature of your spiritual practices. So when a person is ungrounded, spacey, or easily influenced, or has trouble setting boundaries, right away you're going to be suspicious with your clients that subtle quality is increased or aggravated. One of the primary ways of reducing subtleness is through reevaluating one's spiritual practice. So I want to talk about that and kind of map out what spiritual practices are subtle and can lead to ungroundedness, that can lead to spaciness, that can make you easily persuaded or easily influenced, or make it difficult for you to set boundaries. So some spiritual practices and worldviews are very ungrounding, and that makes it difficult to establish that strong conviction, or makes it difficult to stand your ground, or even to speak with confidence. So if you have an excess of subtle quality in your personality, then you may consider reducing some of these more subtle spiritual practices and beliefs. So one of the most famous practices, one of the most famous spiritual debates that goes back thousands of years is this question: are we all one, or are we all individuals? Right? We hear that in some spiritual belief systems, that we are all one. And in other people will really emphasize, oh, we're all individuals, we're all unique. Well, those both can't be true at the same time, or if they are, we have a tendency sometimes to emphasize one or the other. So this question of subtle quality can be a question of metaphysics and the nature of reality, like, are we all one, or are we all individuals? And monism is any philosophy that says all is one. And what are some characteristics of monism where all is one? So monism itself is a theory or doctrine that it denies the existence of a distinction or duality, perhaps the distinction between matter and the mind, or God and the world. And people who who are monists tend to have these kinds of personalities, right? And you may not know that you're monist, but you may be monist nonetheless. So let's think about that. People who are monists tend to think of that everything is made up of energy. All is energy. That there's this universal ground field of energy, and that there's this universal prana that is pervasive, flowing through all things. That all is spirit, right? You've heard folks say that all is spirit. Ultimately, everything equivalent to everything else. That God has no form or attribute or nirguna. God is nirguna. You hear there's a number of philosophies that say God has no attributes, God has no form, God is everything, is another way of saying that. This is a kind of cosmic consciousness there. And science occasionally expresses this viewpoint as well. The science will sometimes say, oh, atoms are the material behind all form. That's not really a chair that you're looking at, but a collection of atoms. And this equation discovered by Einstein, E equals mc squared. Energy is equivalent to matter times the speed of light squared. Makes everything equal. Makes matter and energy. There's this vast matter and energy field. So that's very interesting. Science sometimes does that. But science is also sometimes very much the opposite. It can also be reductionist, seeing difference in everything, right? So holistic versus reductionist, right, is a kind of field in which this question, this philosophical question, comes up. Altogether, this viewpoint that this idea that all is an energy, all is everything is equivalent to everything else, is really expresses something very etheric, and that's why it aggravates subtle quality in Ayurveda. And when the person has this point of view to excess, now naturally we want to see commonality between things too, and we'll talk about that. But if a person has this to excess, they see like everything's the same, right? They become a little detached and kind of a little bit indifferent. Their job, for example, may lose their meaning, or their relationship may lose their meaning. All is one, right? We should love everyone equally, or family can seem meaningless. And so a person who has this way of life to excess ends up leading a life of searching instead of one of commitment to anything in particular. Because all is equal, it's hard to commit to something in particular. And I would say this worldview unplugs the root chakra and can erase the passions. So the opposite of this all is one mentality is cherishing the individual, a particular individual, not just any individual. So G.K. Chesterton talks about this issue of are we all one or are we all individuals by comparing it to a potter working with clay to make a statue. And then we have to ask the question, in your life, in your spiritual life, is it more important to you that the statue is made of clay or that the statue has been shaped into a bust of Napoleon? Here we see, it's actually not a clay statue of Napoleon here, but imagine it was. We see that there's this bust of Napoleon on one side or this clay on the other side. Is it more important that Napoleon is made of clay or that the clay has been shaped into a bust of Napoleon? Is it more meaningful to you that I'm John Immel or that I'm a collection of atoms? So a person with excess subtle quality tends to gravitate towards seeing the collection of atoms or seeing the clay. And a person with insufficient subtle quality tends to only see differences. They can't see our commonality, right? And we've seen this work out in social justice issues, where in racism and other issues like that, where people I see differences that may not exist. And so we all have to be careful about this issue. Are we all one? Or are we all individuals? In community, we often need to acknowledge commonality. We need to search for commonality, brotherhood and sisterhood. We need to acknowledge that our actions have global consequences, that we have responsibilities. But the assertion that differences don't exist at all is equally dangerous, right? In excess, the all is one mentality erases individuality and makes everything the same. And it takes away the face of the individual, right? Everyone has a unique face. Our faces are not the same. And so people are not interchangeable. You can't just, break up with your girlfriend or boyfriend and replace them. That's not possible. But a person who has this all is one mentality may think that way to excess. And so Oftentimes, the all is one mentality can lead to indifference to individual suffering. But so can the other way, right? If a person sees differences between things, they might say, oh, well, that person's so unlike me, I don't care about them, right? So the antidote to a person who has an excess of this all is one mentality, the antidote is cherishing a face, adoring a face, perhaps of someone they love. Cherishing is a practice of attachment. So if you have a practice of detachment, and you have excess subtle quality, you can switch that practice around and start a practice of cherishing, which is the practice of attachment. Cherish something in particular, your hometown, or for example. So by cherishing, you reestablish the ability to commit, and that creates stable quality and creates a strong root. Right? This question of whether we are all one is a very cosmic. We kind of think in the cosmic level. So this question of whether we all individuals or whether we are all one can be paraphrased by some of these thoughts. Where do you see God as being more present? Is God more present here in the cosmos, or is God more present here in this photo of Bambi? I have a photo of Bambi on the screen here. And where do you see God as being more present, right? In the cute little Bambi or in the majestic cosmos? Now, God is obviously present in both of these places. But where do you tend to focus your energy? How about this question? Do you focus, or should I, let me say this in the first person. Should I focus on all of humanity or my wife? Well, obviously I need to have a focus on all of humanity and my wife, but where am I putting the emphasis? Am I putting the emphasis on universal love, or am I putting the emphasis on personal love? So this idea of think global, act local may be a way of mediating between two of these issues, right? We want to think globally, but act locally, right? I want to love my wife and recognize that my local actions, that my actions that are focused locally and personally affect the world, right? That what I do locally affects people globally. And so that kind of puts us in this perspective that is grounded on both sides of that equation, right? Another question that brings up this issue of the cosmos or the person, is God mere consciousness, or does God have a body? So, and where are you along that spectrum? Do you think God is only consciousness, or do you think God has a body? So in monism, this idea that all is one, God is consciousness and awareness, but has no form at all. If you look at Judeo and Muslim beliefs, God has a form and an attribute and a quality, right? God has a certain personality, but God is universal and doesn't have a body in the Jewish and Muslim faiths. If you look at the Christian faiths, God has a body, right? God became incarnated in the form of Jesus Christ in the Christian worldview. So God is corporal, but also universal at the same time, because Christians have the God of the Jews, but also has the incarnation of Christ. And so there's this idea that God has a bodily form and also a universal form. And then there's the pagan worldview, which is God is the world and all things in it. So God is fundamentally embodiment. And oftentimes, even in pagan faiths, you'll see that that there's an element of monism in it as well. That you'll see that in Hinduism, for example, there's also this idea of Brahma, which after you get beyond the sort of gods that have form, you also have this God without form, which is Brahma. All right, so I think we've thoroughly covered this idea of are we all one, or are we all individuals, or is God cosmic and universal, or personal and unique? So let's talk a little bit about disembodiment practices. People with aggravated subtle quality tend to follow this consciousness model that we've been talking about to excess, preferring spiritual practices that emphasize disembodiment. So Yoga Nidra is a very subtle form, more subtle than Yoga Asana, and it has a kind of floating quality to it. You've probably heard of astral travel, people who attempt to travel outside of their body. So astral travel meditation techniques are very disembodied. empty bowl meditation, or any kind of meditation that really seeks to empty the mind or suppress the mind. Any etheric or ambient music can be disembodied, or overdoing meditation or chanting Om. Om itself is a word of detachment. It kind of floats above reality. If you overdo that, you can introduce too much subtle quality, or if you have excess of subtle quality, you may limit your chanting of Om. Meditating on the breath. You see this in a lot of yoga classes that they say focus on the breath. And if a person has a lot of subtle quality, that kind of focusing on the breath is very atmospheric. And so what you want to do for your subtle clients, clients with excess subtlety, is redirect that just a little bit. Instead of focusing on the breath, focus on how the body feels while breathing, or the movement of the muscles that engage in the breath. So you're taking the focus off the atmosphere itself and bringing it back to the body, so that you're bringing them into their bodies instead of beyond their bodies. So feel the muscles move while you're breathing. Feel the breath hitting your nasal passages, perhaps. So the focus on the sensation is perhaps it's a nuance, right? This change from focusing on the breath to focusing on the feeling of the breath is a subtle change itself, but it brings people to their body and away from the atmospheric sense of things. All right, so what about over-identification with the thoughts, mind, or spirit? This idea that I think, therefore I am, is a spiritual belief that can aggravate subtle quality. If a person has excess subtleness, this belief can be problematic. So the medieval Enlightenment philosophers, such as Descartes, claim that the person, or the identity of the person, is their mind, that the body is not the identity, that if the body were to pass away, then the identity would remain intact as a mind only. You see some kind of postmodernist things where there's this idea that like the mind, a person's like entered into a computer and they're just their mind now. They're no longer a body. And so this idea, I think, therefore I am, expresses this idea. This is a very common way of life, or common thought pattern among intellectuals who see the mind as more important than the body. And American culture itself espouses mind over matter. What does that mean anyway? To say my mind over my body is what it means, and that can lead to ungroundedness. And that go, 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 go attitude of American culture, too, can be very disembodying, and it causes the person to override their bodily cues in favor of their goals and their work. So spiritual people, I've talked about the people who over-identify with emotions and thoughts. Spiritual people in general see their identity as their spirit instead of the whole package. And so these folks may even reject the body altogether. So spiritual doesn't necessarily mean holy, right? Holy and holistic come from the same word. And a spiritual person over-identifies with their spirit. And I would say that that is not holiness. I had a client who, in our sessions, kept saying things to me like, the stomach wasn't feeling well, or the head was having a headache. And then she said, the body was tired. And after she said this for a while, after like a half an hour of listening to this, I kind of had to wonder, and eventually I asked her, why do you keep referring to your body in the third person? And she said that her guru had instructed her to speak this way to destroy attachment to the flesh. So this is the person who believes that their spirit is the most important thing and that the flesh is to be discarded. And I would say that that's not Ayurvedic. Ayurvedic emphasizes the body, the mind, and the spirit. The body is seen as the instrument of all good in some faiths, and we can't do without the body because then we can't do good things anymore. All of our good, kind, and charitable acts not only require that we have a body to do them, but something is good, kind, and charitable because it has an effect on another person's body and their real, material, important body. So other people's bodies are also important. All right, lastly, I want to talk about another spiritual belief that can aggravate subtle quality, which is emphasizing the viewpoint that all is mystery, that all is unknowable, that truth is unknowable, can aggravate subtle guna. So emphasizing that objective truths don't exist can aggravate subtle guna. Or another version of this is a person who believes that essential truths exist, but no one knows what those truths are for sure. That creates a lot of uncertainty and confusion. There are some things that we can know are true, and some things that are good for us, and some things that will harm us. Or people who say that morality is merely a construct. That can be also express this idea that there's a mystery around morality. Cultural relativism, in general, can undermine a person's convictions. So, this photo was for a person who is more in their mind. And here we see a person who is confused by cultural relativism. There's some people on the left that believe a certain way, some people on the right believe a different way. Which is right? It's hard to figure that out. And so cultural relativism can really undermine conviction and confidence and make a person easily influenced. It can aggravate subtle quality. So this idea that everyone gets to decide what truth is for themselves is a kind of non-committal attitude, or a very uncertain attitude. There's some people who think that all is mystery subscribe to a spiritual life of mysticism, right? And what is mysticism? Mysticism is this idea that we can become one with God or the absolute through some kind of ecstasy or altered state of consciousness. Mysticism is anything that suggests that one should free oneself from matter and receive direct illumination from God through a mystical, ecstatic, or a prophetic state, right? And that kind of idea is very aggravating to subtle quality. So people who are going to bliss out, right? Who have an excessive desire to stay in the state of samadhi. And you see that there are some spiritual practices that are constantly emphasizing this heightened state of consciousness, right? That they're always looking for a heightened experience. They're looking for a spiritual high, or even an actual high using drugs. That they're always wanting to be in a continual state of inspiration, and that is a very subtle experience. Such individuals may seek the exotic, or something that's always amazing, or a mesmerizing experience. You see mesmerizing experiences sometimes when you go to kirtan. So if a person's kind of always wanting to be in that kirtan state, then that could be aggravating to subtle quality. So what's the problem with that? The need to be in a continual heightened state of awareness often comes from a rejection of the mundane, a rejection of the day-to-day, and perhaps even a despair that the world or the local town we live in isn't enough for us. That the local town is somehow flawed by design. Or sometimes it can come from pride, that I am destined for something greater than this local town, and so I need to search out the amazing or the inspirational. So this viewpoint kind of casts doubt on the goodness and beauty of creation itself, right? That like we have our little corner of the world that we live in, and it is beautiful and wonderful. So the antidote to mysticism is appreciating the mundane. It's restoring hope in the very simple acts of nurture and care for other people, and that recognizing God's presence is everywhere, including here and now. So those are, I've discussed in this talk a few different spiritual practices that can aggravate subtle quality that you should be cautious with if you have a client who has excess subtle, or if you have excess subtle yourself. And then you would want to reduce some of those practices, or adopt practices that are a little bit more embodied and a little less subtle. All right, climactic causes of subtle, marching right along. Long lecture. Any extreme climates, cold, dryness, wind at the top of the mountain. Even the sound of wind is atmospheric and etheric. So you see here this picture of this mountain. Can you imagine standing on the top of this mountain with this wispy fog blowing off of it, and you hear the whoosh sound? That's going to really give you an outer body experience. Any kind of unpredictable weather can increase subtlety. Long days and long nights, like in Alaska in the winter, it's dark all day and night. Subtle guna is aggravated by these times: old age, fall and winter, the time period of 2 to 6 a.m. or p.m., and any time of big change, dawn and dusk, moving, starting a new job, having a baby. And here's an example of an older person in winter with the wind blowing. All right, food-based causes of subtle quality. First, anything that's directly subtle, like coffee, alcohol, sugar, and tobacco, just has a profound effect on you. Anything that's a diet that's too light, like food that's full of bland taste, like bok choy, radishes, cabbage, and cauliflower. These are all negative calorie foods. They're called bland taste not because they taste bland, but because they have no macronutrients in them. So they have no sweet taste. A khichdi mono diet, clear broths, the things from the brassica family like broccoli and kale. Dry foods, like popcorn, lots of fun, but can increase subtle quality. Diuretics like dandelion root, asparagus, celery, parsley, rice crackers, and rice cakes, very drying. Rough foods like radishes, garlic, coffee. Too much roughage in your diet. Excess pungency, having very spicy foods, lots of chilies and cayenne pepper, again, radishes. Bitter foods, dandelion, lettuce, endives. Coffee without any cream in it. Saltless foods or unflavored foods, just a bowl of steamed vegetables. Flavorless foods tend to be devoid of all passion, and they, kind of make us a little more detached and take away the savor and enjoy of life. Things that are without spices or too bland or overcooked. And I mean bland this time, I'm meaning in the Western sense of the word, not the Chinese medical sense of bland taste I talked about earlier. Fat-free foods. Oh, there's some chilies right there. You eat that little pile of chilies there, you're going to be totally ungrounded. All right, herbs that aggravate subtle. The aromatic or ethereal herbs like mint, eucalyptus, pine, the scent of pine, lavender or ginkgo. Aromatic herbs just make you feel spaced out, right? You drink a bunch of mint tea, you feel like you're in Never Never Land. The aerial parts of the plants in general are more subtle than the roots, especially the flowers. So this lavender flower in the center of this photo is very ethereal. Bitters like neem and dandelion. Clear herbs like castor oil. So strong purgative will make you poop like a bunch of times until your whole system's cleared out. That will make you feel like a ghost. Very subtle. Red root, Oregon grape, yellow dock, and red clover. Vasodilators and diaphoretics. Cloves. Turmeric. I've talked about caffeine and foods that contain caffeine in them. And anticatarrhal. Things that clear out the respiratory tract. They don't necessarily aggravate subtle so much as balance the gross quality. But those peppermint altoids, those are very aromatic. Those are extremely subtle, right? They're really spacious. All right, pungent herbs, chitrok, pipali, black pepper, any kind of pharmaceuticals have a huge subtle effect. Marijuana, totally spacey drug. Right? It really makes you space out. Or hallucinogens like ayahuasca and peyote. All right, what about treatment for excess subtle? Notice I have a picture here of a woman that's comfortably, luxuriously sleeping with fluffy pillows and a comforter. That sleep is the opposite of excess subtle and spaciness, right? Unless you're having lots of vivid dreams. So what is the prognosis, first of all, for excess subtle? Excess subtle guna, in the end, is very difficult to fix because of the etheric nature. It makes it really hard to pin down. Generally, you want to build ojas, increase warmth, and get rid of ama. So, nurture and care reduces subtle quality. Putting on weight. But really, it has to be viewed on a case-by-case basis. The person may need spiritual advice. For a hormone imbalance, you don't want to just dump a bunch of heavy food on the person to get them to calm down and get grounded. So a lot of people will eat comfort foods to get more grounded, but that may or may not be the right way to go. All right, so lifestyle treatments for subtle, aggravated subtle. You want to introduce stability, healthy relationships, a stable home, moving back to your hometown perhaps, affection. You want a proper routine, a good dinacharya, right? With abhyanga, daily massage. Having a home base, that you own a home, that you have a family, dogs, financial resources. Getting involved in your community can be grounding or ungrounding, depending on the community. But you definitely want a good insulating tribe, right? You want a good stable community. So in this we have to make the point. What is or what are the qualities of a stable community? One, that the stable community has people from all generations. You see there's a little kid there. There's some older folks. No one very old in this photo, though. You want to see that people in the community have remained in the community for their entire lives. So people in your family have been in your family your whole life, unless someone marries and brings in another person in. Staying in your hometown. People live in their hometowns their whole life. But, if you leave your hometown, then, everything's going to be new. Maintaining childhood friendships. Places of worship tend to be lifelong. So if you have a place where you have a spiritual worship, places of spiritual worship, generally the people are there for a long time. But if it's just a shared interest, like a hobby that you have, oftentimes people get really into a hobby and their interest lasts maybe 3 to 5 years and then they move on. So if you're expecting a long-term community to come from your interest in a hobby, you may ultimately get disappointed. So think about that. Staying in the company staying in good company with friends and family, people who will help you restore hope, and staying with loved ones. Make sure you're sleeping enough. We've talked a lot about that. Authority is perhaps to some a surprising way to reduce subtle quality. And what and how does authority provide and reduce subtle quality? Authority provides a standard. It provides a structure. It provides a container. So in that sense, it creates a lot of strength for an individual. Authority builds confidence. If you have a credible authority that's trustworthy, right? Your authority has to be trustworthy, has to be credible. It should be around for a long time, not just some new person who calls themselves authority, but something that's been around for many, many generations, and we've seen the results of it over time, hundreds of years even. That's a real authority, right? And when you have a credible authority, it improves your confidence, and you can put your confidence in it. And then suddenly you find yourself in this position where you've put faith in something beyond yourself, and even something beyond your friends, something you can really believe in. And that is what makes you less subject to persuasion and influence, right? If you don't have that, then you're trying to figure it all out on your own, and then you're going to be subject to influence and persuasion again, to influence and persuasion to your own whims even, to your own appetites, to whatever is pleasing you in the moment, or to what your friends say, to what emotions you might be having in the moment, or to faulty understanding. We all like to think we have an accurate idea of the truth, but I only need to go back 10 years in my own life to see that I had made a lot of mistakes, that I had a lot of faulty understandings. And so we don't want to trust ourselves too much. We don't want to have a lack of faith in ourselves either, naturally, but we need authority to have that confidence. It's very difficult to maintain a consistent identity without authority. What are some examples of authority? Now, obviously, the best examples of authority are authority that's been in place for hundreds of years. But what are some authority figures in our life that we can look to? Our parents. Our parents need to assert authority over their children. such as going to bed on time and eating your vegetables and doing your homework. And in our experience, by that I mean me, myself, and the other practitioners at Joyful Belly, in our experience of working with children, we found that children feel safer and are better behaved when there are rules that are enforced versus an unstructured free-for-all. We all remember the teachers in our child life that, when we were children, that had a lot of rules and had a lot of structure, and we actually liked them more. And then there were teachers that had no rules and was a free-for-all, and we took advantage of them, perhaps, and the class was really unruly, and no one really liked those teachers. At least that was my experience. So other authorities. We give government the authority to create law with our vote, right? We vote, and that gives a government official the authority to create a law. And we have to put our trust in the government on some level. We often do. We rely on government services in so many areas of our life. Police are an authority that preserves and enforces the structure of law. So people aren't breaking into each other's homes all the time and creating lots of instability and violence and all that, right? But then some people say, well, what about police brutality? Well, there are people who always abuse the law, but that doesn't take away our need for the law. That doesn't take away our need for the police either. A church or a place of worth can provide authority on community behavior and on morality and spiritual advancement. And Ayurveda provides authority on how to be healthy. So those are some examples of authority. Foods that reduce subtle quality. Comfort foods. Home-cooked meals made with love and heavy ingredients. A nice stew of fresh veggies and potatoes made by your grandma. Chicken soup. Hearty foods in general. Foods with a high caloric content that stick to your ribs. Nice stews. Foods that build up your body and help you gain weight. Foods that create satisfaction and that dull the mind. Rich and oily foods like sticky banana bread or bread pudding or rice pudding or buttery mashed potatoes or grilled cheese. Nut butters, ghee. Desserts and sweets can make a person, as long as they don't get a sugar rush. Desserts and sweets, cakes and cookies and sweet vegetables. Obviously, this picture here probably has too much sugar in it, so maybe not this. Don't eat that. Root vegetables like potato, sweet potato, and beets. Food with the gross quality, and I don't mean gross as in disgusting. I mean gross as in like very material and nuts and boltsy, and which include animal products like meat, like beef and pork, and fish, especially rich, oily salmon, dairy products, and eggs, especially the yolk of the egg, bone broths, and foods that have dense, slow, or dull quality, like a cheesecake or heavy cheeses or milkshakes, and dairy. Here we see a little milk chai here. Tamasic things. Tamasic things means more like sleepy or taking you out of that cosmic awareness. Mushrooms. Garlic. Ojas building foods like ghee, dates, milk, and even fruits. Sour foods can be a little overstimulating, and that could aggravate subtle quality. But sour also makes a person feel grounded. It's called grounding the Shen in Chinese medicine. Basically, you'll notice that your eyes relax after you eat something sour. So take note of that. Salty foods also can be very grounding and less subtle. So what about herbs that balance subtle quality? Sedatives like tagar and valerian, or ojas building herbs like licorice root, ashwagandha, vidari, and shatavari. There's a picture of shatavari. Shatavari and bala. And notice that all of those ojas building herbs are all roots, by the way. Nervines like skullcap, shankapushpi, and brahmi. Muscle relaxants here, elephant's head and cramp bark are two muscle relaxants. Then we have our adaptogens like ashwagandha and rhodiola. Tulsi here, holy basil, I'm going to actually disagree with my own list here. That can be a little bit aggravating to subtle quality. And then our tonics like Chyawanprash or medicated ghee. So this has been a introduction to subtle quality. Of course, you can never fully cover all things that are subtle. I said this would be a difficult lecture. It was. Hopefully you've gotten a lot of good nuggets from it and some good ideas on how to help your clients with excess subtle quality. Thank you so much again. My name is John Immel. I'm the director of Joyful Belly Ayurveda. And I hope you enjoyed today's talk. Take care.